Okay, before we get started with our watercolor lesson, I want to talk a little bit about the supplies that we'll be using. So for this watercolor lesson, we're going to be using a set of watercolor paints. And this is just a standard set of paints. It's 8 colors. So we have red, orange, yellow, green, blue, violet, brown, and black. And then with this case also comes with a handy paintbrush. And then also little wells for mixing paint. And so I like to use these wells when I'm mixing color. So often I don't use colors straight from the well. So we have a brush and we have a paint set of watercolor. We also need a good supply of clean water. Clean water is a very important element in watercolor painting. I also have a pencil to sketch my cat, which is what we're going to be working on today, as well as some paper towels. I always have a lot of paper towels handy. This is a great way to dry your brush. So when you are working with a dry brush stroke or dry brush technique, you want to be able to have something handy to get the extra paint or water off your brush. Then of course one supply that we're missing is the watercolor paper. So the watercolor paper is a very special kind of paper made specifically for watercolor. So this is a little bit different than typing paper. It is a little bit different than mixed media paper. This is a very textured surface. This is a cold press watercolor paper, 140 pounds. Doesn't mean that the paper weighs 140 pounds. That means that the ream of paper, which is 500 sheets, is 140 pounds. So it's a little bit thicker and to absorb the extra water. For me, I also tape down the surface of my watercolor paper. This helps prevent a lot of buckling. With this watercolor paper, it's going to buckle a little bit, so once it's dry, a good rule of thumb is what I've always done anyway, is to flatten it down with some heavy books once it's completely dry, and then it'll flatten out a little bit better for you. So today's lesson, we're going to be painting a watercolor cat, and the cat's going to be looking out the window. So this is really the back side of a cat. And later on in the magazine, if you have a copy of the magazine, we'll look at how to draw the cat's face so you can practice other features of the cat. So this cat is actually very easy to draw. This is the cat that's sitting on a windowsill and it's looking out the window. So we're going to looking at the back of the head, the back, and then part of the tail. And we're going to later on draw the windowsill. So let's talk about the head. The head is going to be a small circle. So my paper size is a 6 by 9. So this is 6 inches by 9 inches. It doesn't matter where you put the cat because we'll have a lot of window space. And really you can be creative as to what the cat's looking out at the window, but we'll talk about that a little bit later on. So I'm going to start with the head of the cat. So this is the back of the cat, of course. And I'm going to start with a circle. And I'm going to just draw very lightly with my pencil. So there's a circle. Okay. And then I'm going to draw another circle, and I'm going to draw this super light because I'm going to be erasing some of these lines. So this is part of the middle back of the cat. So it's just light sketch. Now as you notice that this second circle is a little bit larger than the first circle. Okay, and then the third circle, which is more like an egg shape than a circle. So I'm going to come out here and I'm going to draw this. Okay, and now I'm going to draw 2 triangles for the ears. Going on one side here, and the other side. Now I'm going to start connecting those lines just a little bit, so I'm bringing in some of that space, and I'm actually going to erase this middle portion here. Now that's a reason why you really want to draw very lightly with the pencil, because it's easier to erase. And then I'm going to erase this part right here too. And I'm going to, okay, so it's starting to take shape, and now I need to put a tail. And really, it doesn't matter what direction you put the tail in, it's up to you, but it's going to start somewhere around right here. And we're just going to have my tail come back right up. And then I'm just going to loop that around. And there's the cat. Okay, I've got some extra lines here. I'm just going to clean this area up. And somewhere around here, I'm just going to put some kind of a straight edge to where the windowsill is going to start. Just a hint so I know where that's going to help me with the painting part. Now if you'd like, now this cat, and you can put more than one cat in your picture. I'm going to stick with one because I really want to have a lot of space for the window and just figure out what I want the cat to be looking at. Oops. Okay, I'm going to erase that. So if we look at the proportion of the cat is, I would say, roughly 3/4 of the length of the paper. So we've got a lot of space here. I want to make the cat big enough to paint, because we want to be able to show a fur-like texture. If the cat is too small, you're not going to see that. Just by the simple rule of thumb that things closer to you are more in detail, things further away lack that detail. So, if you get a chance, let's go ahead and get started with the drawing of the cat, and then we will pick up the painting part. Okay, so we have drawn our cat, and now we are getting ready to add the fur-like texture with the watercolor paint. So we've drawn the cat on watercolor paper, and now we're ready to start painting. But before we start painting, what I'd like to do is I always keep scrap pieces of paper, old watercolor paper, because I want to be able to test my colors to figure out if that's the right color for the cat, because just from experience, my experience is watercolor is not erasable. So I want to be able to play around with the different colors, because I like to mix colors. I don't like to use just a straight brown or a straight yellow, for a cat, because these colors are not very similar to what a cat really, the cat fur is. For this cat, I'd like to, do something along the lines of a reddish brown, almost a burnt orange kind of coat. So I'm going to start with, my brush is dry. It just came right from the watercolor kit from the last time I used it. And I'm going to wet my brush. And I'm going to figure out the colors that I'm going to need. Now, I've been using my watercolor set for quite some time. But I want you to keep in mind that my watercolor my paint wells, they're still very clean. And that's important, because if you start getting a muddied color in your paint wells, is that you're not going to get a very nice color to start with. Same with water. Water always needs to be clean with watercolor, because that's going to help keep your paints very clean. So I'm taking my brush and I'm getting it wet. And I know that I'm going to use a little bit of brown. So I'm just going to start coming in here and just putting some water to start activating that paint that's in there. And I also know I'm going to use a little bit of orange, so I'm going to put some water in there, and I'm going to just come back and forth and start filling this well up with water. And as soon as I'm starting to mix it, because that's going to really get that nice rich color that's in that for paint. I'm not sure if I'm going to use a little bit of red, but I think I'll just go ahead and get a little bit of water there just in case. I might need a little bit of red. That's what's important, is when you start painting your cat, is to play around and figure out exactly what colors look best before you start actually painting on the extra piece. And really, when you go to practice your techniques or your brush strokes, you can use old watercolor paper like I have here, or just a regular piece of paper, just a quick practice, whatever's easier. So I've got a little bit of brown that's wet. I've wet a little bit of orange and a little bit of red, maybe a little bit of yellow. I'm not sure if I'm going to need it or not, just a little bit. Now my water here is already starting to look a little bit muddy. And I think it's time for me just to put the camera down for a second and get some clean water. Okay, I've got some clean water and my brush is now clean. Now I can go ahead and start mixing my paint. I like to use these little paint wells to mix my paint, but if that is too small and it's not handy for you, you can also use a paper plate, which I use for my bigger mixing colors, and this one's got like a little bit wax coating on it. Or I use an old plate that's been around the house for a while, and this works well too. But for this, because the cat's not very large, I'm going to go ahead and use just the wells that come with the set. So I'm going to pick up some brown and I'm going to put it in the well. Now see how that color just kind of flows? That's pretty good consistency for watercolor paint, meaning that you're not going to paint just from the well. You need to add water to it. In fact, the more water that you add, the lighter that paint's going to get. But I want this cat to be, have a little bit of an orange tint to the fur. So I'm going to come back in and grab some brown. I'm going to clean my brush out and clean it off like this. I'm going to add a little bit of orange. So I'm going to pick up the orange and I'm going to just mix it right in here. And I'm just going to kind of spread that out here, and then I'm going to let it actually mix in the middle. Okay, so now I've got kind of like a burnt orange, and if I want to add just a little bit more orange, I can come back in, or I can clean my brush and pick up some more here. So let's check this out. So I'm going to get the extra paint off my brush so I can get a good idea of what this paint color looks like. And I'm just using the tip of my brush, and I'm just going to do a real quick test to see if that's the color I want. It's still very light, which is good because it's, I like to use light watercolor for fur because I can build up my fur textures. So let's try this on a little bit more brown. So I'm going to clean my brush out, pick up a little bit more brown, make it a little bit darker just so it has a hint of orange. And now I'm going to clean off my brush a little bit and try that. I think that's going to be a good first layer. And I can always come back in and pick up more orange. So you keep playing around, with your practice until you find a color that, for a cat fur that looks really good. Actually, I like that a little bit better. It's got a little bit more orange. It's got a nice orange brown to it. So I think that's great. So now I want to practice what that fur texture looks like. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to dry up as much brush as I can. Okay. And I'm just going to do some real quick brush marks. I'm going to pick up just a little bit of paint, and I'm going to start painting the fur. Real quick, short, and I'm just using the tip of my brush, and I'm just going to go a little bit shorter than that because this is a real long-haired cat. And I'm just going to start building up my layers. We're going to do a layering technique for this cat because we're going to do a first layer and we're going to let it dry. Then we're going to come back in and add some a little bit darker color and a little bit darker and a little bit darker until we get the whole cat finished. So I'm pretty happy. I think I'm pretty confident that I can paint this cat, and I think we're ready to move forward. So let's move to the good paper, the finished piece of art. Okay, let's get started to paint. So I have my paint well that's mixed with a little bit of brown, a little bit of orange, and I'm going to use just the tip of my brush. And of course I've got a nice clean cup of water that's ready for cleanup. And I'm not going to cover my brush with a lot of paint. I'm going to test it out here a little bit. And now I'm going to get started. I'm going to use the tip of my brush and I'm going to come back and I'm going to start with those ears. And remember, even though it's light, when this dries, we can go in even darker and keep adding layers. Once every layer dries, come back in and add more layers and more layers until we're happy with the look and feel. So look what kind of brush marks I'm making. I'm just making real short, quick marks. And I'm going to keep going. And notice the direction I'm going in. I'm going into the direction of the fur. I'm not going this way. I'm going to go all the way down until I finish this cat. And I'm going to try to stick in those outlines that I made. If you end up going outside a little bit, that's fine. So I'm going to keep on going until I run out of paint on my brush. And you don't really want to overload this paper with a lot of water and extra water that you brought for your brush, because what's going to happen is your paper is going to start to buckle. And if it buckles a little bit, that's perfectly fine, because you can flatten that out with a heavy set of books or something heavy in your house. You notice here I'm starting to run out of paint. And I'm also starting to get, see what's happening to the brush, for the hairs of the brush, because there's lacking water, it's starting to spread out, and I still kind of like that texture. So I'm going to keep going until my brush is completely empty. And you see how I'm just kind of going in small, short, swift paint brush strokes. I'm going to continue that because that's going to help us achieve that fur-like texture. Okay, looks like I'm out of paint. Now I'm going to come back over here and I'm going to pick up a little bit more. A little bit too much on my brush that time, but that's okay. You can come back in and finish making that a little, blend that in just a little bit with more layers. I think I'll start adding a little bit of a stripe on that tail, so I don't want to cover that completely. And I'm just going to come back over here just a little bit and just finish and just fill this in just a little bit more to kind of make that the same level of darkness. One thing about watercolor to keep in mind is that it dries a little bit lighter than when you first painted it. Something to keep in mind. So we got the first layer done on this cat. Okay, we're going to let this dry and then tackle layer number 2. This cat is dry, and it's kind of warm outside today, so that didn't take very long to dry. So now I'm ready to tackle the second layer. And I think what I want to do is I want to add a little bit more orange, brown to this, a little bit more orange. So what I did is I came back and I added a well of just orange, and this is my well of just brown. And I have a little bit of the reddish, orangish brown that's over here. I think what I want to do is just pick up a little bit of orange, and I'm going to tab my brush dry. So I dab a little bit of orange paint in my brush, but not a lot of water, very, very little water. And I'm just going to come back in and do another layer. See how you can start seeing how the orange, and I'm not going to cover the whole thing. I'm just actually just going to go a little bit here and there, and I'm just going to continue this process with different colors until I'm satisfied with the way the back of the cat looks. I'm not too worried about the pencil marks right now because those will be gone later. And while that's, because I didn't add a whole lot of paint to that, I'm not even going to clean my brush this time. I'm just going to come back in and pick up a little bit of brown. Just a little bit. And I'm going to really focus in on those ears and make them a little bit darker. A little bit more brown. Maybe this area right here where the back cat is. Focus a little bit on that. And with this cat, because it's looking out the window, I think I'm just going to add a little bit of darkness on this side, just to give it a little bit more depth. Again, just real quick brush strokes. Not a lot of paint. Not a lot of paint, not a lot of water. Just because I really want to really focus on that fur texture. If you look real close, like how much paint I'm picking up, just a little bit. just a little bit, just to give it a fur-like texture. And now I'm going to work on the tail, and I'm going to put a few marks here. I do want to fill in maybe that with a little bit more orange, because maybe the tail is a little bit more orange as you get closer to the bottom. That would be really cute. And we're on the line a little bit, that's okay. The cat's having a bad hair day. Now I think before I finish this off, I'm going to dip my brush straight into the brown, mix it in with a little bit, because I want this to be a little bit darker color. I'm not going to go straight from the paint well, but I'm going to mix it just a little bit of water, a little bit it off, and I'm just going to finish this up with a little bit more dark, going the same direction as I've always done in these other ones. You know, the direction of the fur, that's going to help with that fur, to keep it look like fur. And I think we can call this cat finished. Now I'm not going to paint the windowsill till last, because I want to focus, my next step would be to focus on what our cat is looking at the window. And really the next series of videos that's a part of this YouTube video will give you some great ideas. And then once this set is over, then I will show you how to tackle the rest of this painting. Okay, let's review what we have learned so far. At the beginning of the video, we wanted to paint a cat that's looking out of the window. To start with the cat, we started with a series of small circles. We have 3 circles that created this cat, along with 2 triangles and a nice curved line for a tail. And then we have a line in here just to indicate where the cat is sitting. In another little segment of the video, we learned a little bit about color mixing. So instead of going to straight brown or straight orange to paint the cat's fur, we actually mixed a little bit of brown and a little bit of orange and used short brush marks to create the fur-like texture. In this video, we also learned a little bit about different techniques. For example, when we are looking at this, we learned a little bit about wet on wet. That is wet paint on wet paper, and we use that technique to create this sky. We also use a nice tissue paper to lift up the paint to create nice cloud-like texture. In this particular video, we learned a little bit about layering. So with layering, we need to start with the lighter colors, let that dry completely, and then we started with another evergreen trees, and we let a little bit darker and let that dry completely. And then we finished the layer of evergreen trees with an even darker green. With this, we also learned a little bit about mixing paint and allowing things to dry to create that nice layering effect. To finish this painting, we also finished with a wet on wet technique by wetting the paper, dropping in a little bit of the green paint, and then taking the tissue paper and lifting up some of that paint as we get to the middle ground. In this particular video, we learned a little bit about blending colors. We started first with the sky, and we started with the red, then came back in with a little bit of orange, and then came back in with the yellow. We let this dry completely, and then we took a piece of corrugated cardboard, and we started with a stamping technique to create the dandelions. Once this was completely finished, we came back in with a Sharpie marker, and we painted the stems. Finally, in another video, we also learned a little bit about how to create a tree. So with this particular painting lesson, we first created the sky with a wet on wet technique. And with this particular sky, we used less paint as we got closer to the bottom, just so we have a nice gradation. We let that dry completely, and then we came back in with the brown paint to create the tree trunk and some of the branches. And then with a plastic wrap, we created a green type of paint, and we started stamping to create the foliage of the tree. Now we are ready to decide how to finish this painting. What is the cat looking at just outside of the window? Is he looking in at the sunset? Is he looking at a beautiful blue sky? Is he looking at evergreen trees? Is he looking at a landscape? Or you can even go in a different direction, something creative altogether. But before we get started, I want to show you a little bit about what to avoid when you finish this painting. So here I have a practice cat. And again, I use a lot of my old watercolor paper to practice these techniques. So let's say your cat is looking at a beautiful blue sky, right? So I have here some blue paint, and I'm going to bring it into the well. One thing you want to avoid if you're going to do a wet on wet technique is to get your entire paper wet. And see what's happening here is if you've got to be careful, because if you're going to do a wet on wet technique and do a blue sky that your cat is looking at, if you get your water very close to the edge, do you see what's happening here? It's just causing a bleed. Now sometimes watercolor artists do that on purpose to create a lot of interest in your painting. So if this is an effect that you do not want, you need to make sure that when you're putting in the wet on wet technique is that you get pretty close to the cat, but you don't get the cat fur wet. So you can get a wet on wet technique like this. So I'm going to use my napkin, dab a little bit of that water off, and I'm going to get as close as I can to the cat fur. So I'm going to get pretty close. I'm not getting the fur wet, and then I can come in and drop in some of that blue. And really, if you do a wet on wet technique like this for the sky, your blue paint is only going to go where the water is as long as you're painting on a flat surface. So that's something to keep in mind. Now if you don't want to do the wet on wet technique and you decide just to paint the sky blue and just like a wet paint on dry paper, you can get pretty close to your cat just by painting like this. Now of course if you go past the lines here, you see what's going to happen is your colors are going to start to mix, because that's just the quality of watercolor. I usually have a napkin or a tissue paper handy, because if I do go past that space, you're able to pick up the paint very quickly and you may be able to repaint an area or recover some of the extra paint that's left off. So you might want to practice a little bit of your techniques before you actually start painting your final painting. So for me, when I went to go finish this painting, I really want the cat to be looking at a beautiful sky with a few evergreen trees. And I think that's how I want to finish this painting. So first what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my brush, and I just have a little bit of blue here, and I'm going to do a wet on wet technique. But I want to make sure that I get fairly close to the cat, but not touching that fur, because I don't want to blue and I do not want the blue and the fur to blend, to do a nice blend. So I'm just going to put a little bit of water. I'm not going to overload my paper, just enough of water, and I'm going to extend it out just here, because when you take the painting off of whatever surface you taped it on, you can trim it to whatever size you need. So I'm just watering this down a little bit. I'm not going to overload it because the paper is going to curl, but we can always straighten that out later when we rest it on maybe some heavy books. So I'm getting pretty close to that cat. And I'm just going to end it right around the edge, the ledge of where the cat is sitting. So I'm going to take a little bit of blue, and I'm going to bring it to the mixing area, and I'm going to take just a little bit of purple, because I like a little bit of purple in the sky. But I'm going to mix it like this, and I'm just going to bring in a little bit of purple to the blue, try to get a color that I'm pretty happy with. And I'm going to dilute that, because I really don't want a dark sky, I want a nice light sky. So I'm just going to start dropping in the color. And again, we're going to trim this off, and in fact, when we go to finish this painting, we're going to have a nice windowsill that's going to cover up some of this lighter blue paint. And I think what I'm going to do is, I like that color, but I want to get it lighter as we get down, so I'm not going to dip any more paint. I'm just going to bring it down to wherever I've already wet the paper. And I'm going to vary the brush stroke just a little bit here. Now I'm getting pretty close to the cat, and I want to make sure that I use dab off my excess paint, and I'm going to get as close as I can to the cat without mixing the paint. Just a nice light blue sky. That's what I'm going to go for here, but you're welcome to paint however you feel you want to finish this painting. I'm not adding a lot of pressure. I'm just using a really quick brush marks to get around that cat. Pick up a little bit of paint here and some water, because I want that to, I don't want a lot of paint color here. I just want enough to get a hint of blue. I want to make it a little bit darker on the top. The paint is still wet, so it's going to flow pretty nicely. And I'm just going to come back in and just use the tip of my brush and get pretty close to that cat. Okay, I think I need a little bit right here. Okay, I'm going to let this dry, and then I'm going to start with the trees.
Hello, I am Michelle Roberts. I am the Program Director of the Occupational Therapy Assistant Program at Parkland College. And I'm excited to be here today to introduce you to CUI's exercise. And what this is just a couple little exercises you can do from a seated position. And we're going to work on breath and some stretches. So sit back in your chair, your back against the chair, feet flat on the floor. And I'm going to have you take your arms out. Your arms are like your wings of the owl. The owl is part of our logo. So your wings of the owl, you're going to bring them out to the side. And you're going to bring them up and take a deep breath in as you go up. Only go as far as you comfortably can go. No pain with this. Breathe in. Turn your palms down and breathe out. And move slowly. We're going to do that again. And you're going to breathe in peace, joy, and then let out anything negative. You're going to breathe in wisdom of the owl. And just let it all out. Then I want to have you roll your arms up, bring your arms, your wings back into a circle. Get those shoulders moving. Breathe in and out. In and out. Think about just spreading those back of your wings out. Okay. And one more. Good. And now we're just going to take another deep breath in with your wings. And breathe out. Another thing the owl does is he looks around, right? So you're going to just look around your environment to the right. Just look at what's around there. To the left. Just moving only your head as comfortably as you can. Back to center. You can look up. As long as it doesn't cause you to be dizzy, be careful with that. And look down. And come back up. And then lean your head to one side as well as comfortable. And then the other side. And that is your CUI's exercise. I hope you felt some blood moving through your arms and you got good deep breaths and you have a little peace and wisdom. Thank you for watching.
Thank you for tuning into CUI's TV. We hope you enjoyed the show. This video can be accessed anytime on youtube.com. In the YouTube search bar, type in UPTV6 and look for their microphone logo. We hope you will join us again next week for more local, engaging content designed specifically for Champaign County older adults. Take care and stay safe.